Welcome back to AU Hoop Talk. We're now joined by Smokin' Al Koken, who's going to be doing the play-by-play for the game on Saturday against the Howard Bison and class of 1974. So this means a lot to you.
It's great. I've been privileged the last few years to come back and do some of the games here at AU, and it's amazing, Dan, every time I come back to campus to see how it has grown by leaps and bounds. Back in 1974, not that I spent much time in the library, but anytime I had to spend time in the library, I would always hitchhike down to Georgetown because our library back then was horrendous. And now you see the Bender Library, you Bender Arena, you see the new campus across the other side of Nebraska Avenue, and just to watch as this university not only has grown physically, but the stature of the university. So to be even a small part of it again is a great thrill.
Yeah, it's an impressive trajectory that this institution has, that's for sure. What does it mean for the school and the program in particular to be on over the air on TV in both the Washington, D.C. market and the Philadelphia market?
I'm sure if you talk to Coach Brennan about it, he'll tell you it's an invaluable tool. It is interesting. One of the things I've done over the last number of years is do play-by-play for then CSN, now NBC Sports Washington, of Colonial Athletic Association games, the former conference where the Eagles were before moving to the Patriot League. And this year's the first year, as long as I can remember, that CAA decided not to televise their games over the air. And I know, talking to coaches last year when they knew that that was going to happen, who were irate, telling me and telling anybody who would listen, we need the over-the-air exposure. It helps us in recruiting. We have kids that you can say, oh yeah, everybody just watches on their phone now or on their laptops. Yep. But I'm also recruiting the parents. And the parents, if they've got the 55-inch up there, they want to watch Johnny play on that. They don't want to watch him on a computer. And I don't think that the people right now at the head of the CAA understand what their coaches are asking for, and that's why I think it's tremendous that the American University Athletic Department has understood the need, not just for the basketball program itself, but for the entire athletic program, for the entire university. The better and broader the exposure, it's going to help everybody.
And you talk about the exposure. I mean, journalism as a whole has changed, and you've been able to see the change for better or for worse, you know, with all the technology and digitalization of everything. What piqued your interest into journalism? Was it something you always wanted to do from when you were little?
No.
Was it something that just here on campus, something got you going?
It literally was by accident. I was in my junior year playing on the golf team, and the best golfer on the team was a guy named Andy Horvitz, who happened to be the sports editor of the Eagle. And one day he came to me and said, would you just mind writing some stories about the golf team for the Eagle? Because essentially he was kind of tired of writing about himself. So I said, sure. So I just used to just write, I'd imitate guys I'd read in Sports Illustrated. I had no idea what I was doing. The very next year he graduated. The new sports editor came to me and said, would you be interested in still writing for the paper? I said, yeah, I had a great time doing it. I'd never taken any journalism courses, any broadcast courses, any media courses, nothing. And the very first assignment he gave me was to do a story on the newly evolving parachuting club at American University. And he said, we want you to jump and do the story on it. So I said, okay, well, you get the paper to pay for it, knowing they had no money.
Right.
He ended up working out a deal with the people who were really doing the parachuting training and stuff, pretty much called my bluff. So I went out and did it, wrote this long two-part story, a lot of first person this, first person that. The journalism professor who happened to come in the one Friday to critique the paper, it was the second of the two parts. And he had gone through and pretty much ripped the entire paper, but got to my thing. He said, I went back, read the first part. He said, without question, this was the best thing in the paper. And I'm like, is he reading the right story? Went up to him afterwards, introduced myself. He was very nice and telling me what he liked about it. I asked him if he'd read some of my other stuff, which I went to his office one day. He did. Of course, he justifiably ripped it apart. But he did say, you do seem to have an ability to find the story and tell the story. Now, whether it's journalistically correct or not, I don't know. But that at least was encouraging. So I started freelancing and working for local papers, covering high school sports, covering a variety of different things. And that one thing led to another, meeting my good friend Phil Wood, who's Mr. Baseball. He was doing a show on WTOP back then when they did Sports Talk, along with Bernie Smilovitz, the former Channel 5 sports anchor. And I started filling in for him. Then I got the weekend job. Then the guy at Channel 5, who was the news director, Sonny Astlin, called, would you like to come down and do the weekend sport? So it just literally, it snowballed. If I hadn't jumped out of an airplane and nearly killed myself by landing on the corner of a cornfield, I probably wouldn't be doing this today.
And of course, you're most closely associated now with the Capitals.
Yes.
And you've had the privilege of covering them since their first game, since even before the
Literally,
first game,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, well, that was one of the freelance jobs I had, was with a bi-monthly sports magazine. It was kind of a newspaper form called Sports Scene Magazine, and I was their hockey writer. And on the very first preseason game in Capital history, they tied the then Stanley Cup champion Montreal Canadiens back in August of 1974. And I've got a picture of me with my hair down to here, Russ White of the Washington Star, Bob Pache of the Washington Post, myself, and then Coach Jimmy Anderson. So I can literally say on the very first day of the first game the Capitals have ever played, there I was. So technically, yeah, I guess I can say I've covered them since their inception.
Now, I don't want to get you in trouble, but is hockey your favorite sport? Because I know you've covered, obviously you've done a lot of basketball.
Yeah.
You've also covered baseball. Anything of those sports that sticks out to you, or is hockey by far your number one?
Well, it is because I've become so familiar with not just the sport itself, but one of the great things to me about the sport of hockey is the people within the sport. I mean, I can really count of my, however far back you want to go. If you want to go back to 74, if you want to go back to 84 when I started covering the Capitals full time on TV, wherever you want to start it, I can count on one hand the number of hockey people I'd say, were A blanks. These are really good guys, and they make it easy to cover. I know, talking with a lot of other sports writers and broadcasters who cover other sports, when they come up and they finished covering an NBA or an NFL or Major League Baseball season or something, then they deal with the Capitals. They're like, man, these guys are so easy to deal with. They're really genuinely good people. So the people of the sport and the sport itself is interesting to me. Growing up in St. Louis, your first love is always baseball.
Yeah.
But when the St. Louis Blues came in 1967, I really did catch a real good hockey fever, and I think it's kind of carried over since then.
Now you've had a chance to do just about everything. You've done play-by-play. You've been an analyst. You've obviously been an in-game reporter. You've written. Any one of those your favorite, or do you just like doing it all and just being around the sport?
Well, doing it all. I mean, I've always kind of considered myself like a great utility player. You can plug me in wherever, which I think has, in some regards, led to longevity of a career. You certainly know.
Especially in this day and
exactly.
age.
You certainly know very well where, what you can, the more you can do, the more possible employees you have. And anytime I have a chance to speak to students, I tell them that. I also tell them, too, I said, you may want to be in front of the camera the way we are right now. But there's two of us here. There's multiple people around working.
Yeah.
So there are many more people behind the camera than are in front of the camera. And if you really want a career, look in many different directions. Don't just focus on this is the only job I want, or this is the only sport I want to cover, or this is the only part of the sport I want to cover. The more you can do, the better off you are, and I think the more fun you have, and I've really enjoyed it. Doing play-by-play to me is the most fun, in the sense that once the game starts and the game ends, you look at your watch and go, that was 2 hours? Wow, that went by like that, because you are so consumed by everything. When you're the sideline reporter, you're looking at different things, you're working on different things. Play-by-play, you really are just that pretty much tunnel vision of what the job is, and I think that kind of is fun. I'm sure you find the same way when you're doing it. At the end of the game, it's like, man, that just flew by, where other people are sitting there going, oh, Jesus, it's 2 hours already. Let's get this thing going. Play-by-play, you control the whole thing, and I think that, if you had to pick one, would be the most fun of all.
Then you get a chance to really tell the story and really consume yourself in that and direct and guide the broadcast. Smoking out Koken, right?
Yes.
That's what you're known as.
Yes.
Glenn Brenner gave you that nickname. Take us through how, if you know, how he came up with it, and sort of the genesis of that, and it's stuck with you, obviously, for decades.
Yeah, for those who don't know Glenn Brenner, not familiar with Glenn Brenner, former Channel 9 sportscaster who passed much too suddenly, about 20 years now gone. I used to work there with him. They used to call it the clipboard guy. Back when pro football had the third string quarterback held the clipboard on the side, I was their third string guy behind Glenn Brenner, Ken Meese, who did the weekends. And when one of them would take a vacation, excuse me, Ken Meese would go up and cover for Glenn. I'd cover for Ken Meese, et cetera, et cetera. One of the other things I did in that time was also the coverage of the Redskins when the Redskins were on, when the home games would be televised on CBS, back before it became, when Fox got the NFC. We would do a live post-game show from, excuse me, from the stadium. So one day, I'm down at the stadium ready to do an interview. Glenn's back at the studio in just right down the street on Wisconsin Avenue. And he says, let's go back down to RFK Stadium and rejoin. And he pauses. I'm thinking, did he forget my name? He goes, Smokin' Al Koken. I just, kind of laughing. I didn't think anything of it. That was kind of funny. Now, he's a Philadelphia guy, so maybe it was the Smokin' Joe Frazier, whatever. The next day, people, hey, I heard that Smokin' Al Koken. I like that Smokin' Al Koken. So the fact that it was given to me by Glenn Brenner, who was a brilliant broadcaster. Mm-hmm. He wasn't the hardcore nuts and bolts. He was just funny. He could turn anything into comedy gold. And I think people really appreciated that approach to sports. And the fact, as I said, that it was given to me by Glenn Brenner, I take that as a badge of honor. And that's why I enjoy being known as or called Smokin' Al Koken, because he, to me, epitomized, I always thought, what was great about sportscasting and broadcasting. Yeah. And I'm glad that stuck, and I'm forever thankful for Glenn giving me that little moniker that's carried over the years.
Because he was able to mesh both the comedy and the sports. I mean, what was it, the weenie of the week or whatever that he came up with?
The McEnroe Trophy. Yeah. He had a cloistered nun at Georgetown who would pick games for him. And he and Gordon Peterson would get together, and once they'd have something going on and would go just make each other laugh. And Maureen Bunyan, who is a terrific news anchor in her own right, would have to kind of, okay, boys, let's break it up. Let's move on now. It just was just nothing but just funny stuff from Glenn Brenner. He could, much like Johnny Carson, when something would go wrong, mm-hmm. he could turn that into something even better than what was going to happen by his ad-libbing and his creativity. He was one of those guys who could say, and this was how, I think you could kind of judge how popular he was. He was a guy that literally would say on the air, if they played the Stanley Cup Finals in my backyard, I'd shut the blinds. But at the start of the Stanley Cup playoffs, he'd go out and do a live shot at Capitol Center, and all the hockey people would come, hey, Glenn, good to see you, because they loved Glenn Brenner, even though he wasn't very fond of his sport. I always thought that was interesting to me, how he could transcend, not necessarily dissing the sport, but saying I'm not a real big fan of it, and turn it into something where people would still want to come and see him.
And even when he passed away, a couple presidents, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, both gave their respects.
It was unbelievable. Again, right down the road here on Nebraska Avenue at the National Presbyterian Cathedral down there. And I remember, not that a funeral is something you want to treasure, but mm-hmm. I'll never forget being in that room. And you could go 1 minute from having tears stream down your eyes when you listen to his kids talk about him, to then Gordon Peterson and other people getting up, and you'd be holding your sides laughing. I'd never been to, at that time, and never have been since, to been in any kind of funeral where the gamut of emotions and the outpouring of people and the people that came to see the viewing at Gawler's down the street before that, just everybody who he touched. It wasn't friends and family. It literally was a line down the block by people from the D.C. area who loved watching Glenn Brenner, and this was the way they wanted to pay their respects. Much the same way recently with the passing of Jim Vance, mm-hmm. how he touched more people than just sports fans or just viewers of Channel 9.
Yeah. And of course, he gave you the Smokin' Al moniker.
Always grateful.
And we look forward to your call on Saturday with the Bison game.
Yes, if we can get Bram Weinstein to pick it up a little bit, we'll be in good shape.
We'll look forward to that. Al Koken right there. We'll take a timeout, back with more after this on IU Hoop Talk with Coach Mike Brennan.